Hey there everyone! Today I am talking about reviewing books, specifically how I rate and review books, because it's a little different depending on the person, and I feel that if you're coming to my channel to see what I think of a book, what I rated it as, I feel you deserve some kind of explanation as to how I approach it. And I don't normally have something that's set in stone, but I do have some very basic internal guidelines that I follow. And I'm going to try and outline as many of them in this video as I can, so you can make a decision for yourself as to whether you want to check out my reviews or how you want to approach them. So like sites like Goodreads, I do use star ratings for my reviews, because most places do that. It's generally a pretty good gauge most people use. So let's start with 3-star, the middle of the road. For me, 3-star is not a great book and it's not a horrible book. It's good enough for me to enjoy. If there's any inkling that I will dislike the book, it gets a lower grade. If there's an inkling that I will really enjoy the book, it gets a higher rating, plain and simple. Most books I read will get a 3-star rating because of the fact that it's very in the middle of the road, and if I can't really put it up or down either way, it will sit right there. So anything above 3 stars is stuff that has impressed me enough to garner a higher rating, and it's highly dependent on what book I'm reading, but I will touch on that a little later on. So a 4-star book is a book that I really enjoyed, but there are still some things in it, or something even, that I'm not too fond of, and I may not always be able to touch on that, so to speak. Sometimes I can't always explain why I feel a certain way about a book, but if there's any inkling that there's something in there that I don't like in some manner, it gets 4 stars. I reserve 5-star ratings for the books that, in my mind, can do no wrong. They are as close to perfect as they can get. If I don't have any kind of knowledge or feeling that there's any kind of flaw in them that will hinder that rating in any way, it gets 5 stars. And as you might think from that, very, very few books get 5-star ratings. I am very, very picky with that. Now, in contrast, let's take a look at the ratings below 3 stars. A book with 2 stars is a book that I, for the most part, wasn't fond of, but it did have its moments that were actually good. So it's not a complete trash book. So if it has any redeeming qualities to it, it gets 2 stars. And 1 star, therefore, is a book that has no redeeming qualities whatsoever. It's complete trash. No matter how long I think about it, there is no way I can redeem the book in my mind, no matter how well it's written, nada. These ratings get a little more complicated depending on the type of book that I'm reading. So for my YouTube channel here, I specialize primarily in vampire fiction, which transcends multiple genres. Sometimes it's fantasy, sometimes it's sci-fi, sometimes it's horror, sometimes it's literary. It's all over the place. After that, the focus is on fantasy and then occasionally sci-fi and horror outside of vampire fiction. So because I really, really love vampire books more than anything else, how I feel about them when I'm done reading the book is very, very subjective, probably more so than any other books that I read. I have a very particular expectation when it comes to vampire fiction, and if a book doesn't fulfill enough of that expectation, no matter how well it's written, it will get a low score from me, right from the get-go. And then, of course, the reverse. If I go in with a very low expectation and it happens to blow me out of the water, then it gets a pretty high rating. A good example of a book that got a higher rating than I expected was Salem's Lot by Stephen King. I heard things about Stephen King I wasn't fond of, So I use that as a way of unfairly judging his writing before I actually read it. It's my first Stephen King novel, and I did not expect to enjoy his writing style, at least for that book, and I did. So what I thought was probably going to be a 2-star book ended up being a 4-star book because I actually really enjoyed it and I didn't expect to. An example of a book that is something that could get a 1-star is Memnoch the Devil by Anne Rice. And that book wasn't written any differently from the other books that she wrote, but it didn't have anything, pretty much anything what I expected for a vampire novel. In the Vampire Chronicles, no less. So I gave it a 1-star rating because, as far as vampire novels are concerned, there was nothing there. If I have an expectation about a book for a certain thing, like fantasy books, for example, depending on the type of fantasy it is, I have different expectations for that too. If it's grimdark, I expect it to be gritty. If it's urban fantasy, I expect it to have a lot of realism mixed in with fantasy elements, blah, blah, blah. Kind of your standard expectations. Aside from just general genre expectations and subject matter expectations, I also have a particular preference for more character-based stories versus plot-based stories. A book has to have a plot in it of some kind for me to enjoy, but if it's mostly character-focused, I'm okay with that. I'm also one of those people who's okay with a lot of world building and exposition, whereas a lot of people are not. So if there is a book that has a lot of that, if so much of what is written is just world building and exposition, I'm more likely to enjoy a book like that than some people. I try to touch on as much of this stuff as I can in my reviews. I try to write the reviews up ahead of time so I can touch on as many things as possible. I don't always succeed in that, though. Another example of something that is a little bit different is manga. I have a lot of similar expectations when it comes to manga or Japanese comics, but there's also the added element of art style. For pretty much every manga I read, it's the art style that helps to draw me in on top of the plot, the characters, and so on. So, in fact, with manga, I would say it's way more of a judging a book by its cover type thing than probably any other type of book, because the art style is what will directly influence whether or not I touch the book. If I don't like harsh art styles, so any manga that has an art style I consider to be too aggressive, I will not touch no matter how good the story is. Even when I tackle books that are outside of my comfort zone, I will still carry a lot of these expectations along with me for that book, as I should. But I'm a little more lenient, I would say, on the ones from genres or subject matters that I'm not familiar with, at least until I become more familiar with them. Right, so that is more or less a rundown of how I deal with rating and reviewing books. There might have been some things that I've missed in that regard, but if there's anything you have a question about in regards to how I would rate like certain genres or whatever that haven't been mentioned, or anything else you might have a question about in regards to my reviews, feel free to put it below and I will answer it to the best of my ability. And with that, I would like to thank you for watching this video. I post a new one on Tuesdays and Fridays. Have a good one, and I'll talk to you all later. Bye!